Howdy, students. Most people who have seriously looked at the climate problem have concluded that we need to take action to address the threat. Indeed, the world made that determination in the Framework Convention, which was signed in 1991. But policies need targets. Without a target, what should go into your policy? In the last video, we talked about how we cannot determine the target everyone agrees with using economic analysis. Instead, the targets the world is presently working towards are a political compromise between what we'd like to achieve, zero warming, and what's actually possible at reasonable cost and effort. This negotiated target is enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which you learned about in chapter 13. In that agreement, the world decided to limit the warming to well below 2 degrees with an aspirational goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. As always, these temperatures are relative to pre-industrial. Let me talk a bit about limits. Don't take them too literally. We don't expect 1.6 degrees to be a whole lot worse than 1.5 degrees, and 2.1 degrees will probably not be much worse than 2 degrees. So these temperature limits are not magical, and if broached, catastrophe will ensue. Nevertheless, we can reasonably assume that more warming is worse than less warming, and the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees may well be significant. The IPCC wrote an entire report on the 1.5 degree target, and they concluded that there was high confidence that there was a robust difference between the impacts at 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. In chapter 8, I showed you this slide, which shows future climate predictions from computer simulations of the climate. If you remember back to that chapter, you will remember that these were determined by making estimates of population, affluence, and technology under different economic scenarios, then using those to determine emissions, and then inputting those emission scenarios into computer simulations of the climate system to estimate how the climate changes in response. However, there's a different way to look at the climate change problem. We can start with a target, say 2 degrees Celsius, and then ask what emissions trajectory would be needed to achieve that. To do this, we first need to understand what's known as a carbon budget. It turns out that because of the very long lifetime of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which I mentioned many times this semester, the peak warming we experience will be equal to the total amount of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. This plot shows the relation as determined by computer simulations of the climate system. The red star shows where we are now. We've emitted about 1,500 gigatons of carbon dioxide, and we've experienced a little bit more than 1 degree Celsius of warming. Given this relation, we can now figure out how much more carbon we can emit into the atmosphere without breaching the 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius targets. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we can emit another 580 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. At the present rate of emissions of about 40 gigatons per year, that translates to about 14 years of emissions. This assessment, by the way, is the source of the oft-repeated mantra that we have a decade or 12 years or something like that to save the planet. I don't think that's a particularly good way to think about it because, as I said above, these limits are not magic. If we can limit warming to 1.6 degrees, that won't be that much worse than limiting it to 1.5 degrees. A limit of 2 degrees Celsius has a correspondingly higher carbon budget, 1,500 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which translates to 37 years at our current rate of emissions. I have not discussed a lot of details, and these budget estimates can be quite complicated and filled with assumptions about climate sensitivity, confidence with which we avoid the target, what you do about other greenhouse gases, and other things. These details can make a difference of a few years, but the overall message is robust. We have little time to waste. In order to have a reasonable chance of reaching either the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius targets, we need to begin deep reductions of greenhouse gas emissions very, very soon. We'll talk about how soon in the next video. And now, your moment of dog.